Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. You guessed it, this isn't our usual set. I'm going to try to be a weatherman today and point out some things to you on this map, which is kind of a kick and kind of an interesting thing because you don't know it, but there's really no map behind me. I have to make this up as I go. I want to introduce this by telling you a little bit of a story or a little bit of a situation. Imagine that the last thing you knew about American history was that the Pilgrims landed on the shores of America in 1621. That's the last thing you knew, and somebody dropped you down in 2011 and said, now make sense of what you're seeing. That would be almost impossible, wouldn't it? It would be impossible. There's a 400-year gap there, and you can't understand what's happening in America today if you don't understand what's happened in that 400 years. You know, that's kind of the way it is in the Bible, because the last situation in the Bible, last story addressed in the Bible, the last history addressed in the Bible is 400 years before the New Testament. And it's not like nothing happened in those 400 years. Stuff happened, and it's stuff that impacts what goes on in the New Testament. The last historical pieces that we have in the Old Testament involve the Persian Empire. And you'll remember Cyrus the Great defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great, by the way, he named himself that, the Great, then sent the Israelite captives back home, the captives back to Judah, to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, and specifically to rebuild the temple, because he believed that the reason the Babylonian Empire fell was because they didn't take care of these temples of all these gods of these nations they conquered. So he sent the Judahites back home to rebuild that temple. They rebuilt the wall, rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. That's about the last that we have. But other things happen. The Persian Empire goes on for a while, but about 333, thereabouts, a man comes on the scene whose name you know, Alexander. Also named himself the Great. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, by the time he was 33 years old, had conquered the world. This whole area, stretching from Greece up here, all the way down, all the way across, even beyond this map, all the way to India, that area was area that Alexander the Great had conquered by the time he was 33 years old. Quite an accomplishment for a young man. He then died of a social disease he contracted while he was traveling. Alexander, knowing his death was coming, reasoned, I cannot allow anyone, nobody is great enough to rule the empire that I ruled. So he decided to divide his empire among his 4 generals. Now 2 of them, Ptolemies and Seleucus. The Ptolemaic Empire is this green section down here, and the Seleucid Empire, the red section up here. That was ruled for several hundred years, a couple hundred years, by descendants of those generals. You'll notice that Jerusalem, sitting right down here, is on the cusp between the 2 empires. And so Jerusalem was kind of back and forth during that time period. There comes a time under the Seleucids when a man by the name of Antiochus, and he has a number after his name, Antiochus IV, begins to reign. Antiochus IV names himself, and he names himself Epiphanes, which means God manifest. The people renamed him. They called him Epimanes, which means crazy fool. So he had 2 names, the one he preferred and the one that nobody called him to his face. When Alexander had conquered the world, one of the things he tried to do was leave behind Greek culture all over the world. He was a devotee of Greek culture, including architecture, dress, language, all kinds of aspects, religion, all kinds of aspects of Greek culture. Well, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, decided that he wanted to Hellenize, and that's the word we use for establishing Greek culture. He wanted to Hellenize or establish Greek culture in Jerusalem. Now this was going to go over like a screen door in a submarine. It did not go over well. One of the things he did was he outlawed all circumcisions. Nobody could be circumcised. Some of the men, the Jewish men, because they would compete in the sporting events, and in competing they would compete naked, surgically reversed their circumcision. I'm not going to go into how you do that on stuff they didn't teach me in Sunday school, but they did it. That was an abomination to the devout Jews. Antiochus even went further. He decided that this Jerusalem temple was a real problem, so he intentionally desecrated it. He went into the temple, he went into the holy place, and on the altar, he burned a pig. Now, if you know anything about Jews, you know burning a pig on the altar in the Jerusalem temple is going to be sort of the ultimate abomination. He wasn't through. He took the juice from that pig and he sprinkled it on the walls of the temple, intentionally irritating, intentionally infuriating the Jewish leadership. There was a clash. Out of this clash arose a family called the Maccabees. That was their nickname, means the hammer. And Judas Maccabeus was the sort of leader of this group of rebels who were going to oust Antiochus Epiphanes, oust the Greek rule from Jerusalem, and restore the temple. He does that. He gets the job done. The Feast of Hanukkah grows out of that incident when they're locked in the temple for 8 days and the oil doesn't run out, and the oil for the candles keeps burning. And so there are 8 days of Hanukkah. And the temple is restored, and the religion of Israel is restored. Things kind of go along smoothly. Well, they're not terribly smoothly, but for our purposes, we won't go into all the details, until a guy by the name of Pompey decides to conquer the world. Pompey is a Roman general, and in 63 BC, he comes into Jerusalem with his armies, and now Israel, or Judah, moves from Greek rule to Roman rule. Rome sets up a series of governors in Israel, or in Judah, and you know a couple of them. You know Herod the Great. He's a governor, even though he calls himself King of the Jews. And you know Pontius Pilate. It's into this world that Jesus comes. It's into this world that the New Testament takes place. But if you don't know that 400 years history in between, some of what happens in that New Testament is not going to make a lot of sense to you. And what's going to happen in that New Testament, you know it and I know it. God is going to send his Son, Jesus Christ, to redeem the world. We'll look forward to moving in that direction in next lessons.